I get this is Jeff again. Good, the sun is out. The sun keeps coming through this window, so I got to deal with the sun bouncing off my face too. So this is the chapter, the subchapter, the kind of the section on working with the Germans and the book Working with the Germans, the video book, and the one that is about Hofstede and all. Three authors and three professors are doing research work on cross-cultural things, and their book or the works that are all about the six dimensions of national culture. I said national identity, but it's national culture. So the sixth dimension of national culture, and the one I want to talk about right now is about masculinity versus femininity. And this is kind of just like this is kind of the big, you know, the whole equity thing and egalitarian thing, and right now, and you know, everything about, you know, diversity inclusion. I don't want to get into that part of it, but there are trends and tendencies which they've actually studied. So this is not like they've just kind of just out of the blue said, "Oh, there's masculine and feminine." They've kind of done a lot of work on this, on cultural aspects of it. And what I want to read here is what they say is the high, the high dimension of masculinity versus femininity. And you got to be careful to say high and low, okay? We're just going to say if it tends to be masculine or tends to be feminine. They say high and low, but now with the whole diversity inclusion, you got to think it makes it sound like, you know, feminine is negative. It's not. Or masculine is always positive. It's not. It's just one end of the spectrum, one end of the spectrum, or one of the other end of the spectrum. So, but they said low and high and low, and I want to be careful not to kind of make it feel like one's good or one's bad. They're just two ends of a spectrum, right? So the masculinity thing, and we're going to bring how the Germans is. So masculinity, it represents a kind of a preference in the society for achievement, for heroism, for assertiveness, to be assertive, and material rewards for success. So a society at large that is masculine, it's going to be more competitive, right? And then the femininity of this stands for, at the other end of the spectrum, it stands for kind of a preference. Oh, sorry, I get the light coming in here. It stands for a preference here. I'm going to try to get the back up here so I don't get in the, it's hard to get back into this light. I'm sorry about this, but this is kind of hard to do. So I can't turn off the light here. This is the break. Some of this is here. So femininity here. The sun coming in. I have shutters. The femininity stands for a preference for cooperation rather than competitive, right? Competitive. For modesty, so not being assertive and being bragging and all that kind of stuff, right? And for caring for the weak, caring for that is the weak, the non-strong, right? Not for the weak of the day of the week, but for the weak, people that are weak. And for quality of life. And society at large is going to be more consensus-oriented. Now, how does it come with the German culture, right? Sorry about the bouncing of the light, but I can't deal with this light here, so I can't change the light here. The sun. The mask. It tends to be a masculine culture, right? And tends to be very results process oriented, but not actually results oriented, but very process oriented. Achievements. I've worked for a German company. It's all about ROI and achievements. Okay, everything's about that, and the results of the quarter, results of the year. Very highly focused on that. Now I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's a tendency. Americans tend to be that, I get too. Um, and there are other cultures that are much less than that. Okay. Now, the really interesting thing that I've seen, and that's the tendency, okay, is to be masculine. And I've actually had Irish colleagues say, you know, that so and so tends to be very masculine in their way of doing things, right? Or I've actually talked with actual colleagues from other cultures too, that when I'm advising me how to approach a certain situation, they say, don't do the masculine approach, right? Don't use the masculine approach, use the feminine approach, which is this other factor, right? And I've actually done that. It actually works I've actually done this approach before, where I've worked out in trying to position something and deal with a very conflictual situation, to rather take the bull against the bull against the horn, just beating each other against the head, masculine, assertive kind of thing, and heroism and all this thing, to actually take a completely different approach, which the colleague said feminine approach, which had to be a female colleague. And it worked because it just threw the German completely off. They didn't know how to deal with it. It was like, oh, and actually two Germans, they didn't know how to deal with it because it was completely just not masculine approach, right? It took a totally feminine approach and was like, ooh, just broadsided them in a different way because they weren't waiting for that. They weren't expecting it, right? So this is really interesting. Um, and however, I will say that there are the whole thing of like doing new work approach, a much more consensus-based approach, very more democratic approach, try to unlearn hierarchies. And I've talked about that in one of my other videos, and talked about the Melissa Lamson thing in the hierarchy, high hierarchy, low hierarchy spectrum trait, right? Um, that the new work thing is actually this consensus kind of feminine approach. It totally corresponds. Because I've seen in those that actually follow and are following this new work approach, where it's more than just experiment. It's much more and much more. That there's a whole thing about caring quality of life. Actually, during COVID, very quality of life, quality, and the whole thing caring for people, rather than just seeing people as chess pieces and just you can do with them what you want, right? A very modesty thing. I've seen people that are really into this new work thing, Germans in the new work, which is kind of rare, really rare. Um, a whole thing for modesty. Don't brag. Don't do it. But yeah, but what you do when you work in a company, you got to brag because you got to sell, right? So it kind of doesn't fit all the time, and very cooperative. Whereas the Germans in general tend to be very, um, you know, who dog eats dog, right? So it's it's really interesting to work with when you're working with Germans that are actually trying to work on a new work approach, or what are you going to call this thing, right? Um, where it's following all these feminine or femininity type of traits, which is very unusual for Germans. And when you get a group of them all following this thing, uh, it's really interesting because then you struggle with, and everyone struggles with what are you achieving? What are you actually achieving? And how do you deal with what you're achieving? And then you'll talk about objectives and key results and stuff, but that will be very vague. Whereas, hey, when you're working in a company or working in an organization where you got to have achievements, it's really weird. It's really interesting, especially if a group or a project or a department or whatever is actually following this more feminine type approach. I don't want to say. I'm trying not to make. I'm just trying to make this feminine type approach, which is a natural trait. Natural cultural traits in the book, right? So it's a book about this, or more than a book. It's a whole set of works where they're not following the masculine traits, right? That's really interesting because you're just getting a whole different perspective on how things work, and that's where you'll see that the Germans themselves, when you have those that are working under a traditionally hierarchy kind of approach, and then those that are working in a new work approach, they're more feminine, right? You get the masculine ones of the traditional approach, and then the more feminine. I'm trying to avoid these words, but that's the words that were used, where more collaboration and all that and consensus based, they cause conflict, creates a lot of conflict, because not everybody's following that expected behavioral norm, right, of that culture. So, so I've seen this, and it's really cool. It's really revealing. It's really it's a good thing. It's a really great thing. I've really enjoyed actually working this kind of situation, where I kind of understand both and I worked in both, or what have both all flavors of this thing, and I have to navigate through it. I actually enjoy this sometimes. Um, Too much of it doesn't help, but I actually understand it enough to be able to not to be able to navigate through it. And but the so the thing here, the Germans are very masculine in this approach, and have been named that. I've heard, like I said, several different cultures, and I don't want to name the cultures because the people know who I'm talking about, right? But I've had several different cultures actually refer to the masculine type of approach of certain Germans, of various Germans, um, over my career, and to see that actually fall through, it just follows steps. It just really does follow suit with everything I'm saying here. Um, and I'm a very assertive person. I'm an extremely assertive person. So I'm not saying that I'm going against. I said I exemplify that myself, even more than the Germans do, to tell you the truth, much more. And this can really cause conflicts with I have found myself being in situations where I'm more masculine and more assertive and more, that way than most Germans are. And so when I get into the ones that with the Germans that are kind of following this a more feminine approach to leadership, or I don't like to use these words, but that's what the words are in this thing, okay? The more collaborative. I'm collaborative. I'm very collaborative, but more modest and more. Um, I'm consensus based too, but I'm not saying. But the ones that want to focus on the whole, you know, much more caring for the weak and the quality of life, I do care for those that are there. But I'm saying when I'm making business things and making business decisions, you got to get things done. You got to get that. Um, the quality of life thing, when there's too much emphasis on it, I'll say we got to stop talking too much about that, because then we're not going to get anything done. And then in the end, we won't get salaries because we won't get paid because we're talking about quality of life all the time. We're not getting anything done. We're actually not accomplishing anything. In the end, not going to get paid, right? So that's where and so that's the femininity kind of thing works better in big companies, big organizations where you're kind of lost and you're not actually expected to do things. But when you're in small companies, you better deliver, or you're gonna die. So you will just be kicked out in small companies that have to survive. They can't. Small companies can't deal with this new work approach and caring for the weak and modesty and quality. You won't survive for very long doing that. I'm not saying it's good, not good, and I'm saying it's very important to do it. But I'm saying, and your whole balance thing, you got to be careful what size organization you're in too, because it's a lot more permissible to have this much more vague kind of thing. Don't worry about the achievements. Don't worry that when you're in a large organization, you're hidden stuff. Then if you're in a small really organization, small company, small thing, and you don't make money every single month, the company's dead, right? So. Um, Startups and small businesses have to be very assertive, or else they just don't survive. Survival of the fittest. I mean, that's what it is. So, and again, I'm not saying all this is right or wrong. I'm just saying it's appropriate or non-appropriate, less appropriate. And you got to find that balance. It's always a balance. Again, it's not either or completely. There's always this balance thing, right? How much on the slider are you plus or minus? On the fader, plus space or minus to the treble, right? So it's more of one of the how much. So, but the Germans do tend to be much more along this masculine approach, and it can cause conflict with those that are more feminine. Have a more feminine trait. Again, I'm trying to avoid using these words, but that's what the words on the scale is they're talking about in this book about Hofstede and all. So so there's that one. And to go ahead and go read the book, go read their works and stuff. They got a lot of good stuff, and it cross validates with whatever a lot of others are saying too. But it's interesting to see their different um, explanations of this compared to the other ones, and with like Melissa Lamson and a lot of others. So I Pascal Baudry. There's lots of others I could cite, but I'd be spending time citing all the references. All right, so so that's that one on the masculinity versus femininity type of scale or spectrum, right? With the Germans.